Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So I am now recovering from our petition drive here in New York State. We submitted our petition on Tuesday, and there's 3 days for objections to be filed. And as far as we know, no objections have been filed. Now, somebody could have mailed objections to our petition Friday, and we won't find out till early next week. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be on the ballot, which is, I think, really important for the politics of New York State and really the country. I mean, a lot of people are saying, the Democrats need more people in Congress and the Senate and the House so they can pass their legislation. But here in New York, the Democrats have supermajorities in both the Senate and the Assembly, and they're not passing the progressive priorities. I'm working on a little statement for the media I'm going to send around to my campaign manager and supporters to send out. But this morning, actually, the New York State Assembly finished business for the year. The Senate left town on Friday or maybe even Thursday night. And there's a long list of progressive legislation that is very popular across the state. It has to do with the New York Health Act, which is a state-level Medicare for All program. I mean, this is the perfect example. That bill was first passed in an earlier version by the New York State Assembly in 1992. Feels like 1892. And it's passed many times since, until the Democrats also got control of the state Senate. And they, promised we get control of the state Senate, we'll get this universal public health insurance program passed. Well, since they got control of the Senate, that bill has not got out of committee in either chamber. The insurance industry poured money into the Democratic Party's coffers, and they don't seem to be able to move on it, or they won't move on it. And it's a similar story. We've talked about it. It's Hawaii, California, and Vermont, where the Democrats got control of both chambers of their state legislature and the governorship. And suddenly, while they said they were for a single-payer public health insurance program, they couldn't get it passed. We got the same problem here in New York. And this year, again, the New York Health Act did not move. And then in 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed, which sets up modest goals. They're high by state standards around the country, but modest goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and moving toward clean energy. The Greens had supported a stronger bill, and this bill is actually compromised between former Governor Andrew Cuomo and a coalition called New York Renews, which is around the nonprofit organizations and Working Families Party. So it's weaker than we would like, but since that bill passed in 2019, there's been no climate legislation passed. And to implement this bill, its goals, it needs funding, and it needs pieces, that set up more specific standards. So there were a dozen bills. The Climate Action Coalition, what was it called? The Climate Can't Wait Coalition, had a dozen bills they were trying to get passed. And only one of them passed in a watered down form. It's a bill that puts a 2-year moratorium on fossil fuel cryptocurrency mining, which is a big issue here in New York. And original bill was for 3 years moratorium. They watered it down to 2. And whether the governor, a Democrat, Kathy Hochul, is going to sign it is far from certain. She says, on the one hand, they're jobs. On the other hand, we got to protect the environment. I think she's going to go with jobs, even though the jobs in cryptocurrency mining is small. A lot more jobs in renewables. I mean, the Green Party is opposed to cryptocurrency, even if it's produced. The mining is even powered by renewable energy, because that's a diversion of that renewable energy we need now for buildings and transportation and manufacturing. So that did pass, but then there are 11 other bills from, the top one for us as eco-socialists is called the Build Public Renewables Act, which would have enabled the New York Power Authority, which is a large, owns a lot of hydropower plants, to build and own affordable renewable energy, and also to spend money retrofitting public buildings with energy efficiency and electric heat pumps. That was the big push, and it didn't pass. It passed in the Senate, but not the Assembly. All Electric Buildings Act would have ended fossil fuel heating and cooling systems in new residential and commercial buildings of up to 6 floors by 2024 and all buildings by 2027. Didn't pass. There was a couple bills to fund the clean energy transition, one for $15 billion, one for taxing the rich for $10 billion. And, probably the most important, although we have a stronger carbon tax, it's called the Climate and Community Investment Act. It's really the coalition that got the what we call the CLCPA, Community Leadership and Community Protection Act. That would provide about $15 billion a year. It's kind of a flat carbon tax over time. We want to, one that escalates over time to create greater incentives and more revenues. But it didn't get anywhere. A bill to ban new fossil fuel electric power generation didn't pass. We have over $330 million in New York State subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Bill to eliminate those didn't pass. The state capitol and Empire State Plaza, which is a big complex of buildings that's now powered by fossil fuel sources. There's a bill to make sure it was powered by renewable energy. Didn't pass. There's a bill to divest the teachers' pension fund from fossil fuel companies. And the city teachers fund is divested. It's almost as big, New York City fund, but the state teachers fund, that bill didn't pass. Bill for some environmental justice measures, environmental impact statements would address the effects on disadvantaged communities, and there was another one to provide the Public Service Commission any programs they fund with job training funds and hiring goals for disadvantaged communities. Didn't pass. So climate action just didn't pass in New York, even though the Democrats have super majorities in both chambers and the governor. And then when you get to criminal justice reform, there was a lot of talk after those, what were called the largest demonstrations in U.S. history after the police murder of George Floyd. So we had a bill to wipe somebody's slate clean once they'd served their sentence, and any parole didn't pass. A Fair and Timely Parole Act, which would have required the state parole board to evaluate inmates for parole based on current merit and behavior, didn't pass. Elder Parole Act, which would have required state parole board to consider all inmates over 55 years old who'd served 15 or more years to be considered for parole, didn't pass. And Qualified Immunity Act. That's a U.S. Supreme Court invented doctrine that shields government officials, and in this case, notably police and correctional officers, from lawsuits when they violate or allegedly violate civil rights. Whether it's, formally exercising the right or bodily harm and injury. And that didn't pass. And then one thing that did pass was they increased the amount of state public employee pension funds that can be invested in these so-called high-risk alternative investments on Wall Street, hedge funds, private equity, real estate. And that means as much as $54 billion more in retirees' savings in those public pensions can go to high-risk Wall Street investments. And there was a lot of money poured in by Wall Street to get that passed. And then there's an equality amendment to the state constitution. A lot of talk about that after this Alito memo or a decision leaked to protect abortion rights and the rights of all LGBTQ people and women. And everybody thought it was going to pass, but apparently the senator sponsoring it was not on the job, and they just ran out of time. So that's all to say, it's one thing to replace Republicans with Democrats. And if you do that, it's another thing to get these progressive legislations passed. And I think New York is a case study of that this year. So that's where we are today. We're hoping we're on the ballot. We're going to, I just outlined the headline I got for that release is 20 reasons to vote green in 2022. From the New York Health Act to all these climate bills to the criminal justice reforms to the protection of pension funds and equality. So we're going to be fighting for those things, whether or not we're on the ballot, but hopefully from the ballot and from the podium at debates and all that. So that's what's going on here in New York. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on nationally. I've been, rooted here in that petition drive in New York. So that's what I focused on today. So I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of the U.S. Marines being forced to give support for the LGBT community? Well, they should. And they're actually kind of bragging about it in some advertising I saw. It was the Marines were probably the most reluctant to desegregate back when Truman made them do it in the 40s. But I'll tell you, by the time I was in boot camp in the early 1970s, they didn't tolerate any racial nonsense. I was in a training company that included people from South Boston, if you know what was going on there, and East Boston, the fight over desegregation in Boston. And those two communities were hostile to it. So you had attitudes coming from those guys. And then another big contingent in our training company were Black guys from East St. Louis, one of the most segregated and poor cities in the country. And some of those South Boston and East Boston guys, had some racial problems. They got booted out right away. The drill instructors wouldn't tolerate it because, when you're in a fighting unit together, you got to have unit cohesion. If you're divided by race, that's a danger to everybody. So just for that practical purpose, the Marines weren't tolerating it. That was one of the good things I saw in boot camp. And it's the same for LGBTQ people. If they're part of a Marine Corps unit, you want what they call unit cohesion, everybody working together, supporting each other in solidarity with each other. Otherwise, you're going to be at risk. So, I don't think the Marines are being forced. I think they understand that that's better for the Marines if they're out there fighting. So, maybe a mandate came from higher up in the Department of Defense. I don't know, but I think once they adopt that position, they're going to stick with it because it's kind of a military necessity. Eric Gray, in your opinion, Howie, how should one argue plan to implement a plan for defunding the police in a state like Florida, where my city of Fort Myers just increased their budget from 50 million to over 52 million? I think you should look at what they did in Richmond, California. There's an article you can find on Jacobin, one of the last articles by the late Mike Parker. I think he co-authored it with another person from Richmond. And they got money transferred from the police budget to social services that were good, that would help with crime prevention. And they didn't call it defunding the police. They just talked about more important priorities and crime prevention. So they stayed away from that slogan, which is, kind of a lightning rod, and it kind of stops the discussion. And, just focused on the concrete programs that could be funded by transferring some funds from the police department to these other services. So what I'm saying is, I think, look at what they did in Richmond. And I think that'll give you a good example of how to argue and plan for transferring resources or divesting some from the police department and investing some in the community. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, what do you think of politicians blaming video games and movies for shootings instead of advocating for gun regulation? Well, I think they're, afraid of the NRA, which is an organization falling apart in terms of its own scandals, but still has a lot of money to throw at elections and a base that they can mobilize. So these politicians are afraid of the NRA. And, video games and movies is probably something to be said for. In fact, I was hearing a story today about how gun manufacturers use video games and product placement in them. Something about how you get your man card back if you get this gun uh, in some of that advertising or those video games. That could influence some small-minded people like this kid down there in southern New York that ran over to Buffalo to massacre black people at that grocery store. So, that's something we need to look at. We need to look at the whole culture. I mean, the whole, machismo thing about, you're not a man if you don't have a gun. And then some people, once they got a gun, they use it. So it's not either or. It's, I think, both and. We got to have reasonable gun regulation. Universal background checks. I mean, everybody's for that, even most NRA members. But the damn U.S. Senate, the Republicans, are afraid to move on it. Even though we have evidence from the Brady bill that when they did ban the sale of assault weapons for a period of time from I guess it was the early 90s to the early 2000s, mass shootings went down. And after the ban was lifted, they didn't renew it. They went back up. So, there are obvious things that need to be done. And so what I think of those politicians, I think they're gutless. Violet Content Boutique. I'm afraid that if we don't get a handle on our gun abuse problem, public transportation and other public gathering activities won't succeed. I'm personally scared of public transportation, movies, etc. Yeah, I think that's an issue. It's, I think, an issue, particularly in the New York City subway system, where actually crime is still far lower than it was in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, and it's come way down. It's gone back up since the pandemic, and that's a reason for concern. But objectively, if you look at the statistics of where you're safe and not, you really shouldn't be too worried about getting on public transportation or going to the movies or to public gatherings. On the other hand, it's understandable with these high profile cases and the high level of gun violence and mass shootings that we have in our country compared to every other country, at least in the industrial world. So, basically every country that's not having some kind of civil war. And even then, we have higher rates than a lot of those countries. So, it's an issue to be concerned about. The gun issue has got to be addressed, and right now with the Republicans basically vetoing anything, nothing's going to get done. We can do things at the state level. New York State actually did do more. It already had strong gun safety legislation, and it passed some more bills in this session that just concluded. And I think while Congress is in gridlock, that's what we got to do. And of course, some of you are in so-called red states, which makes me laugh. I was out petitioning, and I talk about the Green Party, and the guy says, "Where's the Red Party?" And I thought he was talking about socialist, and he really was talking about Republican. How did the Republicans get the socialist color? Well, they did it because some map on TV had blue for Democrat and red for Republican when they were doing the Electoral College, and that stuck, which is kind of funny, kind of absurd. But in any case, in those Republican states, you got the same problem that we got in the U.S. Senate. The Republicans aren't going to do anything about gun safety without, a huge mass movement, making it impossible for them not to. And right now, we don't have that. There's, a lot of effort, but the ability of the NRA and those types of organizations to mobilize gun owners, basically with scare tactics. I mean, they tell those people that the Democrats are going to take their guns, which the Democrats have no intention of doing. To require a background check. I mean, it may prevent somebody who shouldn't get a gun from getting one, but that's about it. Nobody's coming for their guns. It's we just need gun safety regulations that are stronger than we have now. And we have good evidence from around the world. Australia, for example, banned assault weapons after a mass shooting in the 90s. And, their mass shooting and overall murder and, gun violence rates went way down. So, we know it works and we should keep pushing for it. But I would say, unless you have particular reason at a particular public gathering, don't let the slight rise in crime we've had since the pandemic, make you afraid to go out. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of Biden ignoring the working class recession going on? Is he ignoring it? I mean, I think he's trying to explain it away. He's not happy about it. Maybe by ignoring, you mean he's not pushing any legislation or policy or executive actions that would provide relief to the working class, like across the board student debt relief for starters, raising the minimum wage. There's a lot he could be doing. And, right now we got an inflation. It's not wages pushing the inflation, even though wages have increased nominally in real terms, inflation adjusted terms, they're going down. So, there's a lot he could do. And, those are, the top two that come to mind for me, raise the minimum wage and student debt relief. Those are things that would help working class people a lot immediately. Eric Gray, I'm just thankful that the school year is over. Meanwhile, there are people that have suggested that teachers be armed, just like the situation in New Mexico. Thoughts on arming teachers? I don't think it's a good idea. Teachers they're trained to teach, not provide security. And even when you have trained security people, they often are not able to, stop a shooter. Or they're afraid to, or they won't, like the police there in Uvalde. So, that's just a bad idea. I mean, the more guns you got in the school, the more likely somebody's going to use them. What we really got to do is prevent these shooters from coming in the first place, which, background checks. I mean, this guy down there in Texas and the guy here in New York, went to Buffalo, both there were good indications that they were problematic and, should not have arms. Raising the age to purchase long guns to 21, I think would help. The statistics show that, I heard another figure today, 6 of the 9 largest mass shootings were done by young men under 21 years of age. So, raising the age to get a gun to the age of alcohol and tobacco in a lot of states, that seems to make sense to me. But arming teachers is not going to stop the shooters effectively. It's not going to deter them, certainly. It may get the teachers targeted. If somebody wants to go in and shoot a school, and they think the teachers are armed, they're going to kill them first. So I think it's a terrible idea. Frankie Lee, how can we start to get money out of politics? Nothing gets done with everybody brought off. Yeah, how can we start? I think given the situation federally with Congress gridlocked, we got to start at the state and local level. And what we ought to start for is not these matching funds programs that like New York City has, now New York State will have in 2024, what's proposed by Democrats at the federal level. When you have matching funds, it actually increases the disparity between people with lesser and greater amounts of funding that matches. And when it's a 6-to-1 match, it's a 7-fold increase. When it's a 2-to-1 match, it doubles the difference between the two candidates. What we ought to do is what they call the clean money, clean elections model, where everybody who qualifies to be on a ballot is qualified to receive an election campaign grant, an equal grant for everybody. And then they can spend it as they see fit. The grant should be sufficient to reach the voters. It should also include access and mandatory participation in publicly sponsored debates and access to public media. And in the federal case, if we get to that level, all broadcast media that's licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. That way, you get everybody on a level playing field. And so we should go it's called full public campaign financing. Partial campaign financing is this matching fund system. And, we can do that at the local level. Big city like New York has done it. But I've, costed it out for Syracuse, New York, where I am. I did this a long time ago, but it wasn't that costly to fund these campaigns. And local campaigns, of course, cost less. There's not as much broadcast media to buy, or any, because it's hard when you're running for a district council seat. It's hard to target your district through, TV and radio. So it's really not done. So it's not that expensive. And this is a case where we build it from the bottom up, because right now there's not a hell of a lot we can do in Congress. And, if the predictions are true, we're going to have, Republican dominated Congress the next 2 years. And, anything along these lines is just not going to be in the cards. So I think we start at the local and state level and push for full public campaign financing. Boss Monk. The biggest question of all is, why hasn't the Green Party been able to break through? We're at the point of our society that Debs was at. Why or how can we make a new party like Abe was able to enter? Well, you mentioned Eugene Debs, and I don't know if you can see with the question up there. I'm wearing my Eugene Debs Hall t-shirt. I spoke there a couple of weeks ago. Let's see. Yeah, there you go. And this is in Buffalo. They have a nice little hall in the inner city. And so, I spoke there about our campaign and our petition drive and, the issues facing us. So why haven't we been able to break through to the point where Debs was at? Well, there's a difference on the left. Back then, going through the farmer labor populist parties, the Greenback Labor Party, the People's Party, through to the Socialist Party, people on the left understood, and this is like socialist politics 101, that we have to have class independence from the capitalists. That means independence from their parties, the Democrats and Republicans. That was just like an axiom. And since the mid-30s, when the communists said, we're going to support Roosevelt, and in other countries support the so-called liberal capitalists against the fascists, that has been the position of most of the left today. The Democratic Socialists of America, the largest socialist group, if you want to call it that, in the United States, is oriented toward the Democratic Party. And as I, said in another context when I was running for president, they get lost in the sauce because they end up supporting liberal Democrats, not socialists. And so the socialist message and the idea that it's an alternative to what we have, a fundamental alternative, gets lost. So that's one reason, the broad left, the progressives, from liberal to revolutionaries, are oriented to the Democratic Party, most of them. And that was not what was true in Debs' time. So the socialists, they were able to elect thousands of people in the first 20 years of the 20th century, and hundreds, through to the mid-30s. A lot of them are local, some state legislatures, a number of members of Congress. And beside them were other independent left parties like the Progressive Party in Wisconsin, the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, local union-based labor parties. And between them, by 1934, 35, as they were going into the 1936 election, and there was a movement for a national labor party within the new union movement, there was 2 governors, 4 senators, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and 13 members of Congress from those 2 states, along with hundreds of independent left candidates elected to municipal office and a few state offices around the country. In 1936 was the turning point. And, so we've got to get, tell the left, the left is not the same as the, liberal reformers of capitalism. And, we got to get out and build this independent party. So why or how can we make a new party like Abe Lincoln was able to enter? What they did, again, was build from the bottom up, starting with the Liberty Party against slavery, 1840, 1844, and it became a broader coalition. For the most part, Liberty Party was still around separate, but a lot of its people went into the Free Soil Party, and then finally the Republican Party. And in the Republican Party, started electing people to local, state, and federal office. So by the time Lincoln ran in 1860, the Republican Party was the largest caucus in the Congress. So, but when he won, he wasn't really a third party candidate. He was really a first party candidate. But they built that from the bottom up over, pretty rapid period, basically 20 years from the time the Liberty Party first came out to be the party against slavery. And then it accelerated in the 1850s. But that's what we got to do. I mean, the idea that we can get some big personality and have him run for president, and it's going to change everything, that person will be isolated if we haven't built from the bottom up, built a base, built, elected officials that would support a president who really wanted to change things. So that's how we do it. We got to, declare our independence from the capitalist parties and then build the alternative from the bottom up. I think that's really what's got to be done. The other thing, and this is, something I've emphasized since the presidential campaign, because it became so obvious in the course of that campaign, with the Republicans becoming an extremist party, exemplified by Trump, most people on the progressive side of the political spectrum just felt they couldn't afford not to vote for Biden, even though they weren't enthusiastic about him at the least. Some of them really didn't like him at all, but they still voted to get rid of Trump. But with that extremist party out there, and what we have is a winner-take-all system. So it's single-member district winner-take-all for legislatures and just winner-take-all for the single-seat executive offices. That creates a situation where the vote-splitting spoiler problem becomes a problem. And it's getting worse because the Republicans have become not just a conservative party, but an extremist party. So I think the other thing we need to do to have a multi-party democracy, to have a political system where the Green Party can take its rightful place like it has in many countries, is to change the electoral system. So that means ranked choice voting for those single seat executive offices and proportional ranked choice voting for multi-member districts for legislative bodies. And so I think, we got to build from the bottom up. We got to declare our independence, but we also got to change the electoral system. And the latter is something we've been doing. I mean, ranked choice voting has really increased in a lot of jurisdictions in the last few years. We went into 2020 with something like 24 jurisdictions with ranked choice voting, and now it's approaching 60. A lot of that since that election. We won some in that election, some referenda to change voting in some municipalities, and we've been winning more since. I think people are hungry for that, and we got some big cases of ranked choice voting, even if they're flawed, like Alaska and New York City and Maine, as well as many cities. So I think we can build upon that. And the key thing is we got to not settle for single-member district ranked choice voting, but we want multi-member proportional ranked choice voting for legislative bodies. That's what will change the system so we become a multi-party democracy in which the Greens have their rightful place. Scout Trooper 164. Lastly, Howie, what do you think of Johnny Depp winning his trial of his ex-wife defaming him as an abuser? I haven't thought much about it. I didn't follow the evidence. I've heard some of the comments that, the Me Too movement, took a hit because of this. But I really haven't thought much about it because I didn't follow it, and I don't know what. I mean, I heard it was kind of a he said she said kind of trial. That's about all I can tell you. I really haven't thought much about it. But um, in the cases of women being abused, I hope this doesn't discourage women from coming forward. Let me just say that. Tired Allison, what are your thoughts about how Social Security can be improved? Well, first of all, you need to raise the ceiling on earnings that pay Social Security taxes. I think now it's about 137,000 a year. Any money you make above that, you don't pay the Social Security tax. Below that, it's a flat tax. So overall, the Social Security tax is regressive. So you need to get rid of the cap and tax people for Social Security right up through to any income. That in itself will make the Social Security system solvent. There was some headlines, a report just came out from the trust fund, and they say Social Security has 13 years left before it will have to cut benefits. That's easily remedied by lifting the cap. In fact, we should increase benefits so that nobody who's retired and living on Social Security is living in poverty. And we presented evidence and funding sources to double Social Security benefits in our presidential campaign. That's on our website from the presidential campaign, howiehawkins.us. So don't be scared about the Social Security going bankrupt talk. It's easily remedied. If it goes bankrupt, it will be a deliberate decision by Congress and the president. And of course, we'd have to fight that if it really comes to that. But it shouldn't. There's no reason. And Social Security is the most popular social program in the country. So if they do want to try to do that, we should be able to mobilize the people to fight and defeat that change. Violet at Content Boutique, how many signatures did we wind up with for your campaign? Looks like Matthew turned in his too. I don't have an actual count for my campaign because I was out getting signatures and other people assembled a petition. But it got submitted. I was there when we submitted it. There's a picture of me holding up one of the volumes together with Gloria Matera, my lieutenant governor running mate. But apparently we got enough because nobody's objected as far as we know. And like I said at the top, somebody could have mailed their objection yesterday, as long as it's postmarked yesterday. So we'll know Monday, and the state board will kind of wait till Tuesday or maybe even Wednesday before making it official. But I'm cautiously optimistic. And, Matthew Ho, they got their signatures certified in that state. County, what do they call them? Clerks, I guess, certify valid signatures and then send them on to the state. And it looks like they got enough. And I think the only thing that remains to be done there is an official statement from the state. I don't know what it is there, Board of Elections or Secretary of State, that Matthew's on the ballot. It's not just Matthew, it's the whole North Carolina Green Party. They had a party petition going on. So now that they have a party line, they can nominate Matthew Ho for U.S. Senate and some other Greens that want to run for other offices. So that's a big victory. And, one of the ways they make it hard for us, North Carolina has always been a hard state. They've won reforms that have made it not so hard, but it was still pretty difficult, and they got it done. So, congratulations to the Greens. Let's give ourselves a pat on the back and then get out there and campaign hard. And Tired Allison is saying in the chat that, yes, Matthew Ho is official. Okay, you're up more than I am on that news. That's good to hear. So congratulations to North Carolina Greens and Matthew Ho. Howie, why don't you run for president? From Mary Cum. Well, I did in 2020. And what I've said about 2024 is I'm not even going to think about it until we get through the midterms, which now turn out for me to be a race for a New York governor. So we'll go through that and then see what it looks like, next November, December, and see what to do. So that's That's all I can say. I haven't said yes. I haven't said no. I'm going to say that later. Violet Content Boutique. Nina Turner is thinking about running Independent Green. Would you want to bring her in for an interview? I love Nina so. Yeah, I like Nina. She's got good spirit. I had not heard she's thinking about that. And if you could point me to a source for that, I would definitely, love to have her on this podcast. Um, so, but is that a rumor or is that something she said publicly? I would like to know. Scout Trooper 164. What do you think of Biden giving armed drones to Ukraine to attack Russia? Well, I wouldn't say they're to attack Russia. They're to defend Ukraine from the Russian attack on Ukraine. So I think, they have the right to defend themselves and getting arms from wherever they can get them to defend themselves. So, my concern is Biden has not been clear about what we're doing there. He had an op-ed in the New York Times this week saying our purpose is to help Ukraine to defend itself, not to attack Russia, not to get rid of Putin, not to have regime change in Russia, which is what he said at the beginning. But in between, as this guy often does, he said, Putin's got to go. It's not his exact quote. His defense secretary said our goal is to weaken Russia. You got loose cannons like Seth Moulton, Democratic member of Congress from Massachusetts, saying we're at war with Russia. Leon Panetta saying this is a proxy war. If that's what they're doing, we don't want that. It's one thing to support the Ukrainians' self-determination and in territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's another thing to use them in a proxy war with Russia. So I think that's something we've got to, make clear in our demands on the Biden administration, among which should be use your influence in the International Monetary Fund to cancel the foreign debt that Ukraine owes. They're servicing debts that their oligarchs undertook because they wouldn't tax themselves to fund the Ukrainian government, before this whole war broke out. In the middle of a war, they don't have the money, to fund basic services. Now, the $40 billion aid package that passed last week, I went over this last week, half of that is humanitarian and non-military aid, for things like dealing with the world food crisis. $5 billion is for that. And to help Ukraine, fund its public services. And then to help the refugees. So we should definitely provide in that aid. And of the other 20 billion, as I recall, only 6 billion was for new weapons. 9 billion is to restore the weapons we already gave them or plan to give them. So that money is going directly to the Pentagon just to restore our arsenal, which, is questionable. The only question I have about that aid is why couldn't you take it out of the existing Pentagon budget, which is bloated and full of waste, fraud, and abuse, and not about defending the country, but about being the world's military superpower and being stationed on over 800 military bases around the world and trying to dictate to other countries, what they should do and who their government should be. All that we got to resist. But, armed drones to Ukraine, this has been going on for a while. Those small armed drones, forget what they're called. I think those reached Ukraine weeks ago. So, but it's not to attack Russia. It's to defend themselves against Russia's attack. Violet, Air Gray. Any recommendations for books to build reading lists for school clubs, such as a Black Student Alliance or a LGBTQ club? Well, if you're looking at, Black history, there are two books by Robert Allen that, I can just were important for me in developing my thinking. One is called Black Awakening in Capitalist America. Came out in the late 60s. And, it covers the movements of the 60s, civil rights and Black liberation movements, and also how the establishment was responding. And in particular, how the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, was starting to fund so-called Black militant, Black power groups, which are really Black capitalist groups, to try to steer the movement. And it was a prototype to what we have now with the nonprofit industrial complex, where these non-profiteers basically are leading the social movements now with funding from capitalists, setting the agenda. They're not democratic, priorities and actions are not set by a grassroots rank and file, but by a staff that's hired by these capitalists in the end. So it had an early analysis of that phenomenon within the Black movement. He came out, maybe a decade later, or I forget when it first came out. It's called Reluctant Reformers. And it's an analysis of all the social reform movements in the history of this country, starting with the abolitionists, through the feminists, the socialists, the communists, the progressive movement. And what it shows is that in every one of those movements, too often, in the whole, pretty much, except for the Wobblies and the Knights of Labor, pretty much, white leadership in those movements said we have to tone down the attack on racism in order to keep the white people in this movement. And they lost the Black people because the Black people had to deal with racism every day. So it's important historical lessons on why, we can't have class unity if we don't get rid of racism within our ranks. So that's called Reluctant Reformers by Robert Allen. So those are two books, reading lists for school clubs. I think, those books can be read by high school students. They're not hard to read. They're not real academic. They're well written. As far as LGBTQ books, I'm really not that familiar with any books I could recommend, but I know they're out there. I just don't have a recommendation on the top of my head for you. So yeah, those are the books I would recommend, particularly for a Black Student Alliance, those two books by Robert Allen. And there are a lot of Black history books. I read one in high school, Before the Mayflower. Who's the author? Lerone Bennett? No, I got that right? Yeah, Lerone Bennett. We used to call him Lerone. We were in high school. And that was, just very eye-opening for me. Before the Mayflower, Black people got here before the Mayflower. And just in itself, that's, an insight that, and the book is full of them. And probably more recent histories have updated the analysis then, because that was probably written in the 60s. And the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think that's, an inspiring story. It certainly was for me. I also read that in high school. In fact, when I was in high school, it was the last year they called it this, but they called it Negro history rather than Black history. When I took that class as a freshman in high school. So yeah, the autobiography of Malcolm X, particularly for young people, high school, that's something that I think a lot of them will take to, and it reads so well that it's like a novel you can't put down. Are we out of questions and comments? We still got a few minutes. Yeah, I'm looking through the chat to see if anything we missed needs to be addressed. AJ Jones says, don't be so quick to dismiss celebrity trials. They still have real life, backlash. Yeah, I would not dismiss them and their impact. Yeah, there we go. It's just, I didn't follow that one. I hardly know who these people are. I've never heard of the woman actually, and Johnny Depp, I just heard the name. So, sometimes when you're following the news, you follow what you're familiar with and not what is unfamiliar with. So, But yeah, those celebrity trials do have impact. O.J. Simpson had an impact. Bill Cosby had an impact. Um, Still having an impact. The Bill Cosby case, or cases. So yeah, I would not dismiss them and their impact. It's just one that I didn't have much to say because I didn't follow it. Howie, what's your favorite TV show? I love The Boys. Man, I came up really before there was much TV. So I never got the TV habit. I just, and I'm kind of a hyperactive kind of person. I have a real hard time just sitting down and watching a TV show. And when a commercial comes up, forget about it. I mean, I got to get out of there. Now I do have a DVR, but mostly I save um, the news. Some news programs or documentaries. Occasionally, C-SPAN, Book TV. Um, you know, Ball games like I'm watching the Warriors, my team. I'm born in San Francisco. Um, in the NBA Finals. And yeah, I can pay attention to sports. That's true. Um, and track and field. There's the what do they call it? The Diamond League has started. Uh, there'll be a World Championship coming up in July. So I've got all that. I got on my DVR. Anything track and field, it records. So my plan tonight is I'm gonna eat dinner and watch the track meet. So that's what I watch. So my favorite shows are sports and news. There's not a TV show. Damn, I don't know if I've ever really followed one my whole life. Um, and I'm not saying that's good. It's just what my interests have been. I mean, it's hard to get me into a movie theater to sit down for an hour and a half, 2 hours and watch a movie. I much prefer interactive things, reading a book or, being online where I can move at my own pace, which is usually pretty quick. I just don't like loitering around waiting for the thing to develop. And, I will comment that on TV shows, I mean, sometimes I'll watch Rachel Maddow, but it's hard. I guess she's only on once a week, but that first segment where she takes 20 minutes to get to the point, it drives me crazy. And sometimes, she's sort of, putting these things out to sort of, you want to know what the point is, but it takes her so long to get to it, and that's an example, I guess, of just me. I don't have patience for people that won't get to the point. So sorry, I can't tell you what my TV favorite shows are except sports and news. Eric Ray, if you were a high school teacher, what subjects would you teach and why? Wow. Um, I would think I'd like to teach history um, and math. I loved math in high school. I mean, I was the kind of student that couldn't wait for the slow pace. So I'd just be in the back going through the textbook, and after, a month or so, I'd worked out all the problems in the textbook. And, and then I was able to do well. Um, so I enjoy math. I just like puzzles and it's so logical. But in terms of most interesting to me, it'd be history and social science, I think, because that's what I do. Much as I like math, I don't spend time, doing math puzzles. I've forgotten more than I used to know, I think, probably in math. Yeah. Violet says watching Rachel Maddow is torture. Yeah, particularly that first section, boy. It's not just you, laugh online says, or laugh out loud, says Tired Allison. Yeah, well, I'm glad she's only on once a week, even though I haven't watched it when she's on. Violet at Content Boutique. Dead and Company are starting tour next weekend. Are you going to their East Coast show? Is that the Grateful Dead? Or is it Dead and Company something different? See, I don't even know that. I mean, when it comes to music, I'm like, old school R&B, uh, the old soul music from the 50s and 60s. That's really, yeah, the Grateful Dead. Yeah, I couldn't, if I heard them, I'd know it was probably them. I think they're okay. Not my first cup of tea, but I'm not going to their concert. I didn't even know they have one on the East Coast. But I'm sure there's some people definitely going because I know they have hardcore fans. Anyway, we can never get gun buybacks to going again to reduce guns, says Frankie Lee. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are a lot of programs going on. We got one in my own city. I think the question is, can we get a gun buyback going for these assault rifles? I was hearing something the other day um, about a lot of owners of AR-15s and other assault weapons, are willing to sell them back. They just want to get their investment back. I think that would take some of the guns off the street. Of course, the people willing to sell them back are probably the people that we need to least worry about doing something crazy with those assault weapons. But yeah, I think we can get that going at every level, local, state, and federal. And it's a good program to promote. We have so many guns on the street that have nothing to do with self-defense. Well, now we're just about up to an hour, and I don't see any more questions. So um, I'll just go back to what I said at the beginning. We just have a great example in New York of why electing Democrats isn't going to get the climate legislation, the healthcare, universal public healthcare legislation we want, the criminal justice reforms, because New York is about as liberal a state and has about as liberal a delegation in the state senate and state assembly as you can find in the country, and they still won't pass these progressive bills, which is an argument for why we need to build the Green Party. And what we need in the Green Party really is we need to organize our locals so we have organizations upon which to base credible campaigns for local office and state office, and soon, hopefully, the House of Representatives. And even we don't have to win the office to move legislation. I've used this example many times. I got 5% of the vote running against Governor Cuomo in New York in 2014. And that was the year he wanted to run up the vote, get more than his father, Mario Cuomo, ever got, get more than he got when he was first elected in 2010. He wanted to get ready to run for president with 2016 coming up. And he got less votes. And he saw 5% of the electorate was with the Greens. And to compete for our vote, he had to adopt some of the things we were demanding that he had never supported before. And that included a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, and paid family leave in New York State. So we can move the agenda and our agenda without taking the office, but by getting enough votes to force them to compete. And we can, set the agenda in a lot of cases, particularly the further down the ballot you go. Greens set the agenda because we have real issues. A lot of these local races are, we all went to high school together, like me. Whereas the Greens come in and say, we need to do A, B, and C to improve our community. And then the other candidates got to respond. We set the agenda. And we can do that at the state and particularly the House level, where, those districts are large, but they're not so large that we can't run competitive races. So I think that's what we got to be aiming for, along with, initiatives or getting legislators to introduce legislation for ranked choice voting, including particularly proportional ranked choice voting for multi-member districts for legislative bodies. I think that's the way forward. And, our time has got to come. We're the party that's dealing with the climate crisis. The climate crisis keeps getting worse. We're the only party saying, cut the military budget and put those resources into the environment and social protections. We're the only party that, is clearly, consistently, and really for a single payer Medicare for all type system. You can go down the list, and the people are with us. We know from the polling. So I know it's a discouraging time in a lot of respects. The Republicans, more evidence is coming out all the time about how they really did try to pull off a coup after the last, presidential election, and they're not backing away from it, really. And so we have an extreme right in this country and a neoliberal corporate center represented by the Democrats, which is a disaster for working people in the environment. So, these issues speak to the need for a Green Party. And we know from public opinion polling that people support us on our policies. So, we're like, the objective situation is perfect for us. Now we got to, build our organization and build our campaigns to the point where people say, yeah, the Greens, they're a realistic option. We're going to go with them. So I hope that will, give people some hope and some encouragement, and, to be active this week, and we'll talk next week, and, let's keep pushing all summer. So have a good week, and I'll talk to you next week.